especially the petitions. But I also want to let you know that I'm going to attach this PowerPoint to my Monday meditation tomorrow, because there's a lot of information on some of the slides that I'm not going to read out loud. And if you want a good look at those, they'll be accessible through the Monday meditation tomorrow. Come on in. There's seats all sprinkled out. Okay. So, what happened at General Conference 2019? I'm going to give a little bit of the background story. I think most of you know this. But at General Conference, which is the global gathering of delegates from all over the world of our denomination, meets every 4 years. I don't know what happened there. Magic. In 2016, at the General Conference, there were lots of petitions having to do with human sexuality and how the church should include or not include folks who identify as LGBTQ. And so the General Conference said, we need space and time set aside to consider all of this, because it had been a source of conflict and division for nearly 50 years. So they called on the bishops. To help. And the bishops established the Commission on the Way Forward that was made up of a diversity of representatives from across the global church, diverse in opinions, diverse in nationalities and race. There were LGBTQ folks represented on that commission, delegates from Africa, lay, clergy. And so they met for nearly 2 years, spent time in prayer and conversation, and they presented to the bishops 2 possible recommended plans. One of them was the One Church plan, which we talked a good bit about here, and many in our congregation advocated for that. That would allow churches and pastors who wanted to perform and celebrate same-gender weddings and who wanted to receive, I'm so sorry, Chase is gone. Yes, I am. You can just wiggle it when it goes. Thank you, Katie. To do that, and would allow churches that were not in support of that to continue to practice their faith as it was with their conscience. The second plan was the Connectional Conference plan, which was a bit more complicated, but would also give an option for churches who wanted to take a more progressive practice and join other churches in a conference that was not necessarily geographically based. So the Judicial Council, which is kind of like our Supreme Court, looked at those plans and ruled on their constitutionality. I've already said that part. They said the One Church plan was ruled largely constitutional, in keeping with our Book of Discipline, our Constitution, with very few minor changes. And they could not rule on the Connectional Conference plan because there were too many constitutional changes needed, and all of those would have had to go to all the annual conferences, and so they didn't rule on that. In the meantime, there was the Judicial Council ruled that other petitions could also be brought to the Special General Conference, and not just those 2 plans. And so a traditionalist plan, among others, was proposed at that time. The Judicial Council looked at it then and said, much of this is unconstitutional. Some of it is not. So that all happened before the General Conference. Also before the General Conference, the Council of Bishops, made up of all the bishops, retired and active across the globe, largely expressed support of the One Church plan. It was over 2/3 of our bishops supported the One Church plan and felt that it had the best chance of holding us together without forcing any one opinion. Okay. So that all happened before General Conference. General Conference took place at the end of February. And one of the things that's beautiful about General Conference is the diversity that's represented there. Multiple languages, people from all over the world, and it was a total of 864 delegates representing our denomination. That is the only body in the denomination that can change our policies, our Book of Discipline. They met for 4 days. Day 1 was spent in worship, prayer, and preparation. That was a Saturday. Day 2, they heard the reports from the commission on the way forward and a presentation also on the traditional plan. And then they decided, they did some votes to prioritize what they were going to vote on, because they had 78 petitions, so they had to prioritize them. And that happened on day 3. And the plan that was decided as a first priority to consider was the traditionalist plan. The one church plan was lower down the list. So on day 4 was when the final voting happened and all of the speeches back and forth on the floor of General Conference. So what petitions were passed? Now there were a total, I think, of 17 petitions that made up the traditionalist plan. Some of those, the Judicial Council had already said these are unconstitutional in a pre-look, but they still passed on the floor of General Conference. Some of those petitions had not been ruled unconstitutional, and they passed. And so we're going to look at some of the ones that passed that have not yet been ruled unconstitutional, if that makes sense. And this is where there is a ton of wording, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. But this gives you an opportunity to do that later if you'd like. One of the petitions tightens up the language around how to define someone who is homosexual. And a lot of this language, to me, seems outdated, but the Book of Discipline says a self-avowed practicing homosexual cannot be ordained and cannot be married in the church. And they tightened that up to say someone who's in same-sex marriage, domestic partnership, or civil union, basically making it even more explicit and more difficult to get around that. The next petition tightens up language around whom a bishop can consecrate, ordain, and commission. So we have in the Rocky Mountain Conference in the United States an openly lesbian bishop, Karen Oliveto. And she was ordained and consecrated in an annual conference that has supported that full inclusion. And so this petition is an effort to keep that sort of thing from happening and to prevent any current bishops from ordaining or consecrating or commissioning someone who is LGBTQ, making that harder. Because there are bishops who will just do it anyway, and this makes it harder for them to do that. This is a big one. This petition establishes a mandatory minimum penalty for any pastor who officiates at a same-gender wedding. It would be automatic suspension for a year, and a second infraction, the person would lose their orders as clergy. Now, up until this moment, it was up to the discretion of the bishop to either hold a trial or to work out a just solution. A just solution, as it's called, can still be worked out, but one of these petitions we'll look at in a second makes it a little harder for a bishop to kind of just let it go away with that just resolution. If someone who brought the charges, so for example, I do a wedding, any United Methodist can bring up charges against me, not just someone in the church, but anybody. And now the bishop has to address that. And it can go to a trial or to a just resolution process. And the person who brought the charges has to be satisfied with the results of the just resolution. So we see where that is and where that goes. The next petition prevents boards of ordained ministries from approving and recommending folks who are LGBTQ for ordained ministry. There are already boards of ordained ministry These are boards that every conference has of lay people and clergy who interview candidates for ministry. And there are places, the Pacific Northwest Conference, Rocky Mountain Conference, other places throughout the United States especially, that are already ordaining folks who are LGBTQ. And it's been a matter for the annual conference. But now this makes it a matter for, there are more consequences and there's more accountability to the global church for that. The complaint process. This petition prevents bishops from just dismissing them arbitrarily. And you can see where all of these are going, toward enforcement and punishment and not allowing bishops in annual conferences to go and do what they want to do, as many are already doing. So these are the petitions that deal with the just resolutions. Whoever it is that brings the complaint has to be satisfied that every effort has been made and has to agree to the resolution also. And if, for example, a pastor who broke discipline by doing a wedding has to promise not to repeat the violation. There are a lot of petitions. This one, I must confess, I don't understand quite as well. So I would appreciate anybody who, maybe an attorney, or if Stacy were here, she could interpret it a little better for us. But this allows churches to appeal trial decisions without it being considered double jeopardy. So if a trial acquits a pastor or convicts a pastor, a church can appeal that. And finally, there's a petition put forward, several, about disaffiliation. Like, how does a congregation separate itself from the denomination if it's gone in a direction that a congregation doesn't agree with? Several of these were ruled unconstitutional. This one passed on the floor of General Conference after some quick editing and bringing it back as a minority report. There's a lot of speculation that this one will also be ruled unconstitutional, but for now, it's out there, allowing churches to leave the denomination for reasons of conscience, applying somewhat equally to progressives and conservative churches. I think, and this is getting into speculation a little bit, but heading into General Conference, there was a very well-organized effort. The Wesley Covenant Association is made up primarily of more conservative congregations who were ready, if General Conference went in a direction other than this, to leave. And what they hoped for was a gracious exit, a way to separate themselves from the denomination. But all of these things passed, and what the WCA and others were advocating for passed. And so they have issued a statement saying, we're not leaving yet. We're going to see how this unfolds. But we'll probably be looking for, in General Conference 2020, which I'll talk about in a second, stronger language about disaffiliation, a more clear path for an exit. So I'm going to get through as much as I can here, and then we'll just open it up for questions that I probably can't answer. But all of the traditional plan, all 17 petitions, was referred to the Judicial Council. And they are meeting at the end of April. And so some of you, Thomas and others, may know a little bit more about this. Some folks who may work in some of our agencies and have a finger on the pulse. There's some speculation that a few of the petitions that were already deemed unconstitutional will be thrown out, and these will stand. There's also speculation that they may just say the whole plan is unworkable, it's unconstitutional, and then we're back where we started. So we're in limbo, waiting to hear what happens at the end of April. I'll stop here before going on and just see if there are any questions. I think there are some of you who, Dre and others, who may be even more well-versed in some of these petitions. Any questions? Stunned silence, yes. So the question is, when we say unconstitutional, whose constitution are we talking about? We are talking about the Book of Discipline, which is a product of the General Conferences over the years, all of the policies, legislation, all of that. Right. The Judicial Council will rule on it in April. And my understanding is it wouldn't go into effect until January of 2020 for the church in the U.S. I think it's a little delayed for other parts of the world. I'm not sure why, but someone else is sure. Yes. Another question? So the question was there did the way the U.S. church voted differ from the global church? And the simple answer is we don't know, because people voted anonymous, on their voting pad, and so we don't know to whom each vote belonged. Other surveys have indicated that about 2/3 of the U.S. church is for full inclusion. So there is some difference globally for sure. But there were also African bishops and other delegates who supported the one church plan. So as we've already talked a little bit about in other settings, I want to be careful about saying, well, it's because of the cultural differences in Africa and all that. I do think that's a factor for sure. But there is more diversity of opinion there as well. So.
Carol, thank you for having this meeting. Has anything come down from the senior reaches of the church hierarchy on what individual conferences or churches can do besides waiting?
Right. Well, and so that is a good segue. So the question was, has there been any word from other conferences or about what churches and annual conferences can do besides just waiting? And that's part of our conversation as well as a congregation. So here's what some folks are saying. Adam Hamilton, who is the senior pastor at Church of the Resurrection, and a very important voice in our denomination. He's been a delegate to General Conference. He has been very much a centrist in a lot of ways, trying to hold us all together. And some of you may have tuned in to some of his statements at General Conference, but he was really heartbroken, as many of us were. And in the immediate days afterwards began to talk about, we need to gather some of our churches who are not behind this traditional plan, who don't want these punitive measures, and who want there to be room for everybody in the church. And so at the national level, even perhaps international, there's some conversation happening about, can we have a gathering to really talk about what's next if these petitions stick for churches and pastors like ours that really find it hard to abide with these things. So the print is too small here, but he said, I will not treat my gay and lesbian people as second class. I will not quietly accept the way backwards as an acceptable way for us to live together as United Methodists. Mark Holland, who's the pastor in Great Plains Conference, people see the hypocrites of the church and it's a turnoff. The discrimination against gay and lesbian people needs to end, and the church needs to be leading in doing that. There are a lot of grieving people right now who feel this is wrong, and I'm one of them. And then you all received, hopefully, my statement the day after conference ended. And it, unbeknownst to me, ended up on the website for this called Mainstream UMC. I would encourage you to sign up for their newsletters. They started as a group that was advocating for the one church plan, and that's where it's helpful for me getting a lot of information about what the larger conversation is. So the Western jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church, so this is in the United States, the Washington, Oregon, California, that whole jurisdiction came out right away and said, we are not abiding by this. We're going to continue to do weddings. We're going to continue to ordain. We're not doing this. The Michigan Conference has spoken out. So there are, what I have sensed in this past month is, there everywhere there are people saying, we need another option. We can't do this. And right now it feels a little bit chaotic, but I think it will coalesce into more strategic gatherings. Yes. Right. So the question is, if there's talk of splitting and leaving the denomination, what are the ramifications of that? What are the specifics of that? So the way that things work is that in the United Methodist Church, property is held in trust by a congregation, but it's owned by the conference, by the denomination. That's why there are disaffiliation plans that are trying to get passed, because the Book of Discipline would need to change for a church to be able to separate itself easily. So some of this is we need to wait and find out what the Judicial Council says about this. There have been churches all along. I know there was a church that our bishop founded in Mississippi that left the denomination. Broke his heart. But they were able to make some arrangement with the annual conference about that. And that's happened at other times. I know of one church that agreed to pay a year or two of apportionments, which is what we pay to the denomination every year out of our budget, and have an exit plan. So our bishop and our conference leaders have said, let's hold off for now, because there are churches, both progressive and conservative, who are talking about splitting and leaving, and they have said, let's wait and see what happens. There's also the regular general conference, the quadrennial, that's coming up in 2020, and that's my next slide, actually. And so I know that I've been part of a couple of conversations with other clergy in our conference about getting some folks nominated to be delegates and all getting behind, the same person. We have a member of our church, I'm not sure I have his permission to announce this, but who wants to offer himself as a lay delegate to General Conference. So what's possible at that General Conference in 2020? Can we undo all of this? So that's a lot of unknown. But I think part of what's called for between now and then is to be exploring and praying about our options and becoming clear on who we are as West End and what we want to say and represent and do and be. Yes? That's a good question. So the question was, who raised the money to build this building in the 20s and 30s? And I know I've been part of a church that the conference gave the land. The conference bought the land, and then the new congregation raised the money and built the church. So I think that's just the way the Book of Discipline is that we hold it in trust. Episcopal churches, Presbyterian.
The Lutheran churches are held by the Synod, and it exists in most Protestant denominations.
Right.
The trust clause.
The trust clause, yes. And I don't know but that is something that's true for many denominations, Presbyterian, Episcopal, Lutheran, and so forth. Yes, Betsy.
Originally, I believe you said that basically the bishops had said, go, we don't know how to solve it, you all do it. Now that they're seeing all this chaos, do you see any movement that the bishops are saying, we need to have a little bit more guidance here and get more involved? Do you see any sense of that?
So Betsy's question was, how are the bishops reacting to this? Are they getting more involved? And one thing I have heard our bishop say is this whole process helped him realize how little power he really has. Their bishops have no vote at General Conference. They are not voting members of the General Conference. And even though they endorse with a supermajority the one church plan, and again, this is more hearsay, but I have heard it said that there were some African bishops who were advocating for the one church plan, but their people were not behind them. And so, and that's true in lots of conferences, not just internationally. Where the bishop is not necessarily where the conference is that they serve. So that's a frustrating piece, I think, for our bishops as well. Other questions before we? Yes.
When you said the Western jurisdiction said, we're just not going to follow this decision, how did they make that decision? Was it annual conferences or individual churches, or who made that?
I don't know. The question is, when the Western jurisdiction made the statement that they're not abiding by this, who made that decision? I'm not sure. But it was a statement that came out almost immediately. There was a video put out, and all of their bishops appear on the video. So it was kind of put out by their bishop. Maybe it was their bishops who said that. I have also heard people saying, we just need to go ahead and start doing weddings and start breaking discipline and let the chips fall where they may. So, there's just a lot of speculation. Yes.
Is there any reason to believe that the Judicial Council will not approve what the conference set forth?
Yes, I think there are some of the petitions that passed General Conference that the Judicial Council had already said were unconstitutional, and they passed anyway, that those will be thrown out. So what we've looked at today are the ones that were not previously said to be unconstitutional.
How large is the Wesley group that had already made some plans to leave the church?
How large is the WCA, the Wesley Covenant Association? I don't know the answer to that.
Is it mostly U.S. or
I think it's a kind of a cooperation. It's an alliance of churches from all over the world that have a more traditionalist approach. So there are some U.S. churches, primarily Southeast, I would say. Churches in Africa and Central America, perhaps, adding on to that. I did want to say that the vote to support the traditionalist plan was about 53-47. It was very close, which if you only have 864 delegates is not that many. A mess. So there was a charge brought to the floor of General Conference that there had been illegal buying of votes, and that was referred to the Ethics Committee. And that's all I know on that. I don't know if anyone knows more, but I think they are looking into that. So, yes, Ann, let me get... Who's on the Judicial Council? Where's Thomas Kim? Do you know the answer? How many are on the Judicial Council, and who are they? Thomas is working at United Methodist Communications, and
I just read the article about it, but I didn't check clearly.
So 9 to 12 people serve on the Judicial Council, and they are elected by the General Conference. Do you know how long they serve? Okay, I'm testing your knowledge. Sorry? For a quadrennium, for 4 years. Okay. Betsy.
Is it possible in 2020 that another plan could be put forward, or
Every General Conference is its own thing. So 2020, who knows what can happen, which is why a lot of there's a lot of organizing going on right now, a lot of strategy. I guess I can repeat this because Will Willimon said it and it's been published. But one of the things that Bishop Will Willimon said, who's going to be here next week, was that his read on it was that many of the more traditionalist folks were very organized and were counting votes and kind of knew what they had. And the folks who were a little bit more on the progressive side were praying and, and kind of assuming, that surely everybody's okay with this. And so now there's a little bit of a, wait a minute, okay, which in some ways is a shame, that we get into our camps and we're going to out-strategize each other. But it does call upon us to, this happened, and this is not good. And what do? And we don't want to do nothing, and we don't want to be silent. And I know there are a lot of folks who feel like, we don't want this to be the only thing we're talking about. But our denomination it's there. It's what is the question of the day right now. And so we need to know how we're going to respond and what we're going to do. And to be committed to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters who are really harmed and hurt by our denomination, by our church, and to name that and hold that together. Yes.
There was a committee formed last summer called the Way Forward Committee that orchestrated the conversations in the fall and winter, and we have begun meeting again to, as lay people, talk about responses, possible responses, and our next meeting is April 7th. I don't even know where. But if you are interested in helping West End craft a response, then please talk to me, Anita Schmidt, and I'll write down your name and email.
Let me cover some of the last little bit, which we've already been talking about, but what might happen at General Conference 2020, someone asked. The Judicial Council, depending on what happens there in April, the Wesleyan Covenant Association may leave. They have, and I hesitate to even say they, because I don't want to demonize anybody, but as a group, they have already got LLC, whatever licenses in every state. So they've been doing some work to become their own denomination. But they're hoping for a better exit plan, a better disaffiliation plan. More progressive and centrist churches may start the process of leaving the denomination. Apparently Adam Hamilton wants to convene a group shortly after Easter about that question. And the number of delegates from the Southern Hemisphere will continue to grow. So some of the things that we have done and are doing here as a congregation right away, and it was a quick decision and it didn't involve the whole ministry table and all of the leadership, but we felt like it was a pastoral response given what happened at General Conference, to go ahead and put flags up for a few weeks, pride flags, to say, we are a United Methodist Church, and we do not support what just happened and what's been in the headlines in our denomination. We want everyone included here in our congregation. We felt like a public witness to that was very important. And I cannot tell you how many emails, phone calls, I have received, and I know some of the folks who were actually putting up the flags received. I had a parent of a Vanderbilt student bringing her child back to campus who left. She said, "Don't have to call me back. I just want to let you know how much that meant to me and to my child." Someone who's worked in this neighborhood for 20 years called me in tears to thank me for the witness of our church. So it's made a difference in these initial days and weeks. Okay, the print is too small here. We're working to nominate delegates for General Conference 2020. Those of us on staff are networking with other pastors and clergy in our annual conference to talk about how we work together to make change. And the question has been raised again, is it time for West End to consider joining the Reconciling Ministries Network? And I'll say a word about that. The Reconciling Ministries Network is a network of congregations who are openly affirming of our LGBTQ friends and who want to be able to join the Reconciling Network. Doesn't say we're going to break discipline. It means that's what we're hoping for and working for change. That network is now trying to figure out, okay, now that this has happened, what kind of work is God calling us to do? What do we need to do? If we were to join that network, it would basically put our church's name on the Reconciling website, so that if somebody moved to Nashville and they were looking for a Reconciling congregation, West End would show up. But I know that's been part of a conversation previously here, and there's, we want to be sure it's a good fit with West End, and so that's a conversation that needs to happen. And it's groups and Sunday school classes can join the Reconciling Network, and our Way Forward team has done that. And there's a picture of them on the Reconciling Facebook page. And I know that there have been some like, wait a minute, are we suddenly a Reconciling church? No, that group has joined the network, and I think there are other Sunday school classes planning to, if they haven't already, other small groups. But for the whole congregation to do that would be a much larger conversation and an important one. So we'll be talking. The Way Forward team has brought that to ministry table, and we want to work together on a process to hear from our congregation about that kind of decision. But regardless of that, we have a lot of work to do together. Yes, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren. So one of the largest complaints I've seen following the General Conference is that the voice of young people and youth was largely ignored there. And so I'm wondering if there's any ideas or plans in place to ensure that young people have more of a voice in the future.
Great question. So in case you couldn't hear, goodness gracious. Workplace injury. No, one of the complaints, a very real complaint about the General Conference and the delegates tend to be my age and older. Either people who do this for a living and can give several days to that, or a lot of our younger people are working or they're in school and just getting started, don't have as much vacation time to give, that sort of thing. And so the question has been raised, how can we get more youth and young adults as delegates? And one of the groups that I've been in conversation with is a group of younger clergy. So this is clergy, but and talking about let's get someone who's under 35 to be a delegate for General Conference in 2020, and let's all get behind that person. We have talked in the annual conference about could we move annual conference at least to a weekend or a partial weekend that makes it a little easier. And our bishop is aware of that, and I've heard him say our churches need to work harder to get younger people represented there. So there was some of you probably heard this, there was a petition signed by youth and young adults that overnight gained 15,000 signatures and was read on the floor of General Conference, opposing these petitions. So that voice was heard by the global church. Yes, Ed.
There's a website called Uniting Methodists. Do they have any traction or leadership potential for what might happen in coalescing churches that feel more favorable to the one church plan? Do you know?
I know enough to be dangerous on that, but there is a group called Uniting Methodists, and I think that's connected with Adam Hamilton. Trey, is that right? Yeah. I think that's a group that Adam Hamilton has helped to shepherd, and so they probably are helping to lead the conversation and networking. Other questions? Okay, so what can I do? What can you do? As always, pray and engage. Watch and listen for further opportunities for conversation, not just around the joining the Reconciling Network question, but other questions about how we move forward together as a congregation. And please, please, please share your thoughts, because I don't want to assume that everybody's on the same page. We want to hear from everybody. So you can contact me, any of your pastors. Face-to-face conversation, I think, is so deeply important. Contact some of our leaders, and here are our three ministry table leaders. Amy Lynch is the current chair, Davis Turner is the rising chair, Alan Horner is the outgoing chair, and they all attend all ministry table meetings. Contact Anita Schmid, who's with the Way Forward team. Didn't get your information up here. But let your voice be heard. I would encourage us to, our feedback, I think, needs to be relational and not anonymous, that we speak from our heart, no matter where we are, and trust that we will be heard, regardless of what our opinion or feelings may be. We want to hear from everybody. And that's one of the main things that I want to call for in this season of life in our congregation is trust. That we trust one another, we trust our leaders, and most of all, we trust God. But this is not the end of the story. This was a surprise and an obstacle and a painful event that I wasn't expecting. I don't think many of us were expecting. But God's work is not done. And our calling is true. And I think we know who we are as a congregation. And so next steps we have to trust God will reveal to us. And I would ask you, too, to keep all of us in your prayers, your staff. I don't want to... my personality, I don't like conflict. I'm like, ooh, I'd rather go do this over here. So to hold me accountable for that and keep engaged and trust. Any other questions or feedback, thoughts? Yes? Do we ever take a vote of the church and congregation? That's a really good question. Voting is hard because there are winners and losers. But I think if we were to make a decision, for example, about joining the Reconciling Ministries, we would want that to be a vote, probably, because we want to hear from everybody and want everybody to feel like they have a voice. If we had other decisions we wanted to make, I think that would have to be by vote. What the Way Forward team led us through this fall was small group opportunities to share and to listen to one another. And I think that has to be our model going forward, that it's conversation and it's dialogue, and that we don't get into the same sort of voting and politicking that our general church has gotten into, that it remains relational and face-to-face and in love with one another. Lena.
If we are to think about joining the Reconciling Ministry, how does that process work?
That's a great question. So the question is, if we join the Reconciling Ministries Network, what does that process look like? I feel like we leaders need to talk more about that and creating space. And ironically enough, this is what my doctoral thesis is all about. So I may use the model I used in there, creating opportunities for people to talk together and listen for any sense of consensus and then allow people to voice and vote. So I don't know right now, but it could be a couple of open meetings for anybody who wants to come, and to gather in small groups in that meeting, share where we are, and then express their preference with a vote. But again, that's me offering one possibility, but that needs to also be talked about with our leaders. Other questions? Yes, Julia. Yes, so the churches that are members right now in Nashville of the Reconciling Network are Belmont, Edge Hill, East End, Hobson. And within churches, I think Calvary has a Sunday school class or two. There are smaller groups within. I think there's a Sunday school class at Brentwood that is reconciling. So smaller groups have done that within congregations. There were some churches that voted the Sunday after General Conference, just like had a meeting after worship and they joined. Because things are different now in some ways. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? So, anything else? All right, well, if I'm going to have a voice to talk about the prodigal son parable, I should probably bring us to a close. But let me thank you once again for your presence, for your input, and invite you to share with your staff and with your leaders where you are. What I want to avoid is, side parking lot conversations and that sort of thing. That we're in this together and we trust one another to move forward together. So, thank you for who you are, and thank you for being here.